Marhaba, or hello to everyone around the world. Today is Friday, June 3rd, 2022. I am Dr. Jack Dempsey, an American writer and historian living in Greece, the island of Crete. And my friend here is Muhammad Ismael, a Palestinian writer living in Deir al-Balah, which is part of the Gaza territory. His family has lived in that, refugee camp for, I think it's about 74 years since they were forced at gunpoint out of their family's traditional village called Shaphir. His grandfather was born by the side of the road before they entered the camp, and his grandmother named the child Jihad, for one who struggles for his culture. And that is part of what Muhammad and I are trying to do, keep the word alive about what's happening in Palestine, and to, share information with people who can get, we hope, a lot of useful perspective on what's going on there and what has always been going on there. It seems that every time we meet Muhammad, I have the same, you could say, litany of the situation. There is a terrible shortage of drinkable water. You're lucky if you have electricity 8 hours a day. People are on a very strict diet, which is determined by Israel. If they let a certain number of trucks into Gaza with supplies every day, it means that something like 12,000 people are supposedly fed from one truck. There's a shortage of medicines. People in despair are committing suicides. They live in a ruined landscape, which they are almost unable to rebuild at all. And they are under a complete blockade of economic and social proportions, where people cannot travel to visit their families or to work, etc. And the world may be tired of hearing this, but we would like to ask them, how could you imagine living it? If you're tired of hearing about it, well, why don't you try living it for a while? And I think that's, something important to keep in mind. Finally, in terms of introduction, it came to me that apartheid is a million forms of murder. It's all we see in the news, that the Palestinians are being shot, killed, arrested, repressed, brutalized in just about every way that you could imagine. There have been at least 5 major global human rights organizations that have declared now in the past year or so that indeed this is classic apartheid society and that it needs to be changed. And yet, with what's going on in Ukraine, where the world declares that people have a right to self-determination, well, what about the Palestinians? Why are they deemed terrorists when the Ukrainian people are being taught how to make bombs to fight for their freedom? It's a double standard that infects just about everything. So, Muhammad, with that horrible introduction, I would just like to thank you for these talks, and I would like to invite you to share anything you wish to share right up front today before we get to our subjects, which I'll mention in a moment. How are things in Gaza this week?
Thank you, brother, for this opportunity. The situation in Gaza, as usual, is not good because, as you know, now we started June, weather is hot, and again we have a severe crisis in electricity. Electricity is in a very, very bad situation. We have this crisis each summer. Not only this summer, but always we have this crisis in summer. If you want to speak about food, these days we have a severe crisis in food. We have very expensive prices. If you speak about the grains, cooking oil, the beans, the lentils, chickpeas, even the chicken. If you want to buy a chicken, the chicken is very, very expensive. The situation of food is not good here in Gaza, especially that the majority of Gaza people are poor, and they have misnutrition. They have anemia. They have some health problems. So can you imagine how they can do with this crisis of food? I think the situation will be not good in the coming few weeks.
And probably through the rest of the summer and the rest of the fall and through the winter again, unless we begin to see some kind of political movement. Is there anything afoot in that sense? Is there anything going on? I mean, we're going to discuss later the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh and other events around Al-Aqsa Mosque, clearing more people, demolishing more homes in Jerusalem, in the occupied territory of the West Bank. The president of Hamas has said that there will be more war if these kinds of attacks go on. What is your feeling about all the recent events in general? How do Palestinian people feel?
Every day we have plenty of events, plenty of news around the hours. Around the 24 hours, you have new events taking place. So many clashes in Jerusalem, in West Bank, even sometimes on the borders of Gaza. Sometimes we have some clashes between the Palestinians and the Israeli army. So everywhere in the Palestinian territories, and every time you have something new, you have something is happening. I think that this summer will be a hot summer. Maybe we will have a new war, or at least we will have a concentrated clashes, especially in the West Bank and Jerusalem. I think after 2 days, maybe the day after tomorrow, I think Jews are going to make a new demonstrations inside the Islamic mosques of Al-Aqsa and the surrounding mosques in the East Jerusalem. So I think from week to week, the ultra-Orthodox Jews are going to make new marches in these places. And, you know, this will lead to continuous clashes between the Arabs and the Jews. And always the Israeli police is interfering, but of course not to solve the problem, but to help and to support the Jews against the Arabs. Can you imagine around the world, whenever you go, you find police is interfering to be a neutral part to solve the problem, not to support part against the other part. What we have in Jerusalem always, that the Israeli police is interfering just to support the settlers, the ultra-Orthodox Jews against the Palestinians of Jerusalem. And sometimes they are beating the journalists, pulling their cameras, and doing something violent against them.
Now, you have told me many times, with many good reasons, that most Palestinians, most of them, do not hate Jewish people. The Palestinians' great wish among the people is to live together in peace, as their grandparents did before the great first Nakba in 1948. And I believe that this is true. But, you know, the world might look at the situation and say, well, on the one hand, what do the Israelis want? What do they expect? Do they want people to come out of Gaza with their hands up and say, we surrender, we are ready to be your slaves, or we are ready to get out of the territory? Well, the last time they tried to come out of the territory in 2018-19, they were shot and killed by the dozen. the great sympathy for Shireen Abu Akleh now is echoed by Razan al-Najur, who was murdered, shot in plain sight while she was helping as a nurse to tend to the wounded at the Gaza's Great March of Freedom. And so it seems to the outside world, at least, that even when the news is saying the opposite, that these marches by the radical Israeli factions are trying to provoke violence, as if they want violence to happen so they have an excuse to become more violent themselves. This is the impression I get from careful watching of the outside news.
Yes. First of all, we have to look inside the Israeli society. Israel is changing all the time. Israel before 20 years, 30 years is not the Israel of today, is not the contemporary Israel. Now, if you look to the Israeli society, what you find? You will find that the majority of the Israelis are supporting the right parties. They are supporting the religious right parties. These days, there is no existence for the leftian parties, even the centrist parties. As you know, that Israel, in the beginning, when Ben Gurion established Israel in the year 1948, the leading party in Israel was the Labor Party. The Labor was a leftian party, you know. After that, the Labor and the other leftian parties were the fundamental political power in Israel, reaching the 90s till the days of Rabin and the signature of Oslo Agreement and the existence of the existence of PA. After that, since the beginning of this century, we have a dramatic change in Israel. We have disappearing for the party, for the Labor Party, and all the leftians. Now all the Israeli society are supporting the right parties and the religious parties. And you know, these parties are believing only in violence, all in violence, you know. So what can you expect from them? They believe only in violence. From time to time, they are making attacks on the Palestinians inside the holy places in Al-Aqsa. So what can we do? What can we do? In 1993, during the time of Mr. Clinton, we signed Oslo Agreement, and we accepted only 22% of the historical Palestine. You know? And we agreed that it's okay if Israel took the rest of the land. So we took only 22%, and we left 78% from our land to Israel. But Israel doesn't make something good, even for the application of this agreement. Now, after about 3 decades of signing Oslo Agreement, nothing is applied on land. You know, so I don't know what can we do. As I told you previous times, I am sure that through military actions, I am sure that we will not achieve anything. So, on the other hand, if you want to speak about diplomatic and political action, what we can do in this way through diplomatic and political action.
And this goes on. Just the past week, an Israeli high court decided the case in favor of Israel, that they were allowed to take more land, about 18% of the existing land, containing thousands of Palestinians. And this land was to be used as a, quote, fire zone, a new military outpost. And what typically happens with those is they are designated fire zones for military practice for a while, and then the military leaves the land open to what are called settlements. These are not settlements, because a settlement happens where there are no people. Colonies happen. The so-called settlements are colonies. They are there to take the land, to inhabit it as its new masters, and to use it as they see fit exclusively. So I can only agree with you that this process goes on and on. Nothing is ever enough, but we might together be able to say that in a dark way, the fact that things are growing more violent from their side is a sign that they know they are failing. That's a sign that they know the rest of the world begins to see the situation for what it is. They don't have any other answers, because they seem to have no love or sympathy in their hearts for Arabs, Palestinians, non-Jewish people. And so they are going to get more and more violent to try to force the world to look like the way they wish it was. And it's simply not going to happen. So they are stuck with their violence as their only method. And even this cannot, in the end, help them. But you are caught in the middle.
Yes, yes.
Well, I think with this long introduction, maybe we could move to a couple of our subjects for today. We were going to try to talk quickly about some of the ancient world's presence of Philistine or Palestinian people. We're going to talk about the coexistence for a long time between Muslims and Christians in the historic land of Palestine. A mention of a book in 1929 by Nikos Kazantzakis, a great Greek writer, as remembered by your grandfather. And again, to have your thoughts about the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. So why don't we move right to the ancient material? I will run through that as efficiently and quickly as I can, and we'll have lots of time to discuss that. I live in Crete, which is a great tourist area. And a couple of weeks ago, some friends of mine met some tourists from the Near East. They said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Lebanon." And they said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Welcome to be here. What is it that makes you want to come here in Crete?" And they said, "We are Philistines. We are Philistines." This was their words, saying that we are Palestinian and we wanted to come here to see some of our historical neighbors and where some of our people and cultural traditions came from. And I thought that was remarkable, that people even now recognize that there are great ancient continuities between the very ancient times and today. Now, in The Guardian, the British newspaper, there was an article a couple of weeks ago. It said, "What is it to be Palestinian?" And their answer was, it's to be ignored, to be dismissed, to be outcast, to be silenced. But you and I are here to talk about what it really means. And that is, to be Palestinian is to be the inheritor of all the traditions that have named and shaped and lived on that land, based in demonstrable fact, based in historical and archaeological and scientific facts that we can all see. Many of the Israeli intellectuals say there never was a Palestine. They never had a nation. They never had a state or a flag or a national symbol or kings. You can't name anything about their government or history, but that's not true. And what we're going to discuss will show that. The name Palestine came from the people who called themselves Philistine. And the first historical mention of that, even if it is from Rome, it means that the Romans got that name from the local people. When the Romans were in that land, they said, "Who are you? Where are we?" And the answer was Palestine. We are Philistines. Now, what does that mean? I think you'll be able to see what that means as I go through. There's only about, let's say, that I can mention right now, a dozen different places where archaeological, scientific, and other evidences show the presence and persistence of these cultures. And everything that I'm going to mention, people can check out in a work called Calendar House at my website, which is called ancientlights.org, on the ancient roots of Palestine. Most people don't realize that the Minoans of ancient Crete, from at least 3000 to 1400 BCE, were in touch with almost every city of the Near East as traders, and sometimes even as intermarried family members. There's all kinds of physical evidence, which I'm going to try to describe. But their basic structure was that, like the Palestinians, they are a tribal family, a so-called loose confederacy, as opposed to a nation state with demarcated territory and walls and flags and all that. Their basis of social organization was in nature. They did not have great kings whose dynasties and names we know from history books now, because they knew that that was a dangerous political idea. A king is only one person who makes all the decisions. You're almost guaranteed to make the wrong decision every time. But instead, they had what they called the rule of the ancestors and the people themselves, the damos. The damos is the ancient predecessor of the word demos, meaning democracy or the people in Greek. Now, after the Minoans fell because of the great volcanic eruption of Thera, Santorini, there was what we call a Minoan diaspora, where they left these lands that were deeply in trouble and joined other relatives of theirs in every direction of the compass. If you think of Crete as sort of the middle of the Mediterranean, they were going to Egypt, to Libya, to Sicily, to Sardinia, to Italy, to mainland Greece, to the Asia Minor, on and on and on. And the archaeology says this. The best source I could recommend today is a book called The Sea Peoples and Their World, edited by Michael Oren, was published in 2000. And there have been a number of other studies that support the archaeological works in that book. But I'd like to just then to wind up here by naming a few of the sites in historical Palestine where we have found connections between the Minoans and the people of the Western Mediterranean and the people of Gaza and Ekron and Ascalon and so forth. Excuse me. Now, the earliest one that I know, there's an article in the book I just mentioned, Sea Peoples and Their World, by an archaeologist named J.N. Tubb, T-U-B-B. His article was called Sea Peoples in the Jordan Valley. Now, that's very far inland from the coast, but he shows us various physical evidences that show at a place called Tel al-Sidayeh that between 1300 and 1200 BCE, there were people from the Mediterranean living and trading on the Jordan River. Why? We'll find out as we just go down this list very quickly. They even built a very sophisticated water system at that place, which is very important in that region, of course. And this is something also that's been matched at other sites. Now, we can see that most of the remains that we find had to do with feasting, the sharing of food and drink among different groups of people. And they used ceramics, pots, great amphora and cups and so forth that they decorated with their tribal and group signs to demonstrate that they were part of the family, that they had a certain status to own these things. And we look at these things now and we see that, geez, from Gaza in the south, all the way up to the area of Tel Aviv today called Dor, D-O-R, this is what the archaeologists call a very uniform civilization. They had, excuse me, quite a lot of physical remains that show they had a common culture. After I mentioned 1300 BCE, there's a city called Hassour, and we have recovered from Hassour a stela, a standing stone, that shows a disc and a crescent moon with two hands like this, reaching up toward the moon and the sun. This is a classic Minoan motif, and we find it in the pottery and other places. That is 1300 or so. Then you have the great entrepot of trade called Ugarit on the coast of Syria from roughly 1400 to about 1200. That city even had what they called a Cretan quarter, and they were in very close touch with people of the Far East, trading for things as common as shoes and sandals, and also rare and precious metals like tin. As you move down the map from the north to the south, there was a city called Afek, where we have hundreds of pieces of ceramics and other articles that are inscribed with a script called Cypro-Minoan, because as the Minoans left Crete, many of them migrated to Cyprus and brought their ancient scripts with them. Afek was one place where those things were used. There's an archaeologist, an Israeli archaeologist, Aaron Mayer, who has done most of the digging on the city of Gath from about 1300 BCE onward. He finds that Sea People's influence there were building olive presses, and they became so expert because they had probably brought it to the Middle East from their homeland where they had long grown olive trees. They were so expert that when the later Assyrians conquered the region, they left those Philistine planters in place to manage the olive oil business because they were so expert at it. And also in Gath, Meyer testifies that in the incense burners in temples there, they found traces of cinnamon and nutmeg. Now, why is that significant? Because in that time, in that place, the only place cinnamon and nutmeg could have come from was Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, my friend, near India. So this points directly to the role of the Philistine peoples as they moved into the region, becoming the guardians of the great roads of trade between East and West. That was one of the reasons for the flourishing of Gaza itself, that it was at the head of the spice roads from the desert, and it enabled trade of that people with the people of the Western Mediterranean. That's Gath. There is also a so-called horned altar, which is another classic Minoan feature at Megiddo, okay? The altars really do, if you stood them side by side, resemble each other tremendously. And in the middle of the highlands, there was a place called Beit Shemesh, where early on, both Hebrew and Palestinian or Philistine people mixed together in doing their trade, in hosting feasts and so forth. This was not tolerable to the later ideological Israeli, but there it is. We have what are called late Hellenic 3C ceramics. These are all over the Near East and all their cities from, as I mentioned, from Dor to Gaza. There's another place called Tel Kazil, where we have evidences of Minoan, Aegean, Mycenaean, and Canaanite populations living together and using many of the archaeological symbols that were familiar, again, from Minoan and Western Mediterranean cultures. There's Ascalon, where just recently they dug up a cemetery of Philistine origin, and the DNA extracted from the skeletons shows that they were from the Southern Mediterranean. And if that's not enough, also in Ascalon, many of the bowls out of which people were eating and drinking were made of clay that had come from Crete. Now, why would they want to be doing that? It must be because they honored their own ancestors still living there. Another city slightly inland called Ekron. We have an inscription 700 years after the arrival of the Philistines and their mixing with the Canaanites that honors the goddess called Pitogaya. And that is a name that relates Crete and Delphi with the Near East. There is a cave in Crete called the Ideon Cave, where dozens and dozens of tributary gifts came from Near Eastern cities to honor the ancestors and the spirits and gods in that cave. And finally, the name of the port city of Gaza today is still called Minoa. So that is a very quick summary of how many places we can find the so-called Philistine or Palestinian presence. And I think that needs to be appreciated in our traditions, because we are told too many times that there is no history there. I don't know how you can claim an exclusive right to the land unless you can show your ancient history there. And the first bit of actual evidence for the Israelis comes in 1210 BC on an Egyptian stela that names them as one of many smaller conquered peoples by the Egyptians. That is relatively late in the game. So I know I've said a lot, but I want to certainly make time for your comment on that. And it looks as though we might have to let our other subjects, well, either make another meeting for them right now or another one for next week. It seems we have about 7 minutes left on our Zoom call, Muhammad. I would like very much to hand this over to you.
Thank you, brother, for all of this explanation about the deep and ancient relation between Palestine and Crete. You just gave a very, very brilliant lecture, an academic lecture. Your information are very strong. You gave us and gave the people who are watching very, very good references. If anybody want to search for further information, I think he can trace the references that you gave us. I want to add just a small thing. Since my early childhood, I studied at a Christian school. Inside the school, we had a church. It was a Catholic church. And inside the church, as you know, we have so many sisters and priests and clergymen. Once, I think I was like 7 or 8 years old, I saw a tall man. This man always he used to distribute biscuits and soft drink for us. Once I asked him, "From where you came? From which country?" He told me, "I came from Crete." From Crete. He was a clergyman. He was a priest. I think he was about 40 years old. He told me I came from Crete. So I listened this word when I was like 7 years only. After that, I used to make some sort of a friendship with this priest. Of course, there is a gap between me and him because he is a big man and an old man, and I am only a baby or a little boy. But he told me once, "Okay, I will tell you some stories about Crete." Once he told me that we are one nation, we are one people. My ancestors came here, and maybe you are a baby of one of my relatives who came here, who came here before more than 1,000 years ago. So can you imagine? So can you imagine? He gave me a powerful push to study and to search for this special relationship between Palestine and especially, as you just said, between the southern coast of Palestine, which locates between Joppa and Gaza, and between the amazing island of Ugarit. Even when I grow up, when I became 20 or maybe more than 20, I started to listen some politicians, some academic people who are talking about this special relation between us and Crete. Even before the death of my grandfather, once he told me that he read the book for Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek novelist. He told me that Nikos wrote two brilliant books. One of them entitled A Journey to Palestine, and the other one is entitled A Journey to Egypt. He told me I read the two books, the one of Egypt and the one of Palestine. But the one of Palestine is very, very, very wonderful. I read it many times, not one time. I read it several times. He told me that this book of Nikos, which was written in an early era, you speak about only the 20s. In that time, the written books about Palestine were rare books, not too much. He told me that Nikos in that book spoke for the first time about the danger of the Zionist project in Palestine, and he mentioned in his book that I predict that after 2 decades that there would be some sort of state for the Jews in Palestine. So he threatened and predicted in his book that the birth of Israel will be maybe after some like 2 decades after.
And that proved to be about exactly correct.
Exactly. He was a prophet, not a novelist, because his vision was applied completely. And in the year 1948, Ben Gurion established the state of Israel on the ashes of our burned houses and villages. Also in this book, he talked about the amazing, the fabulous harmony and coexistence between Muslims and Christians of Palestine. He spoke that in Palestine we have so many churches for the Christians. We have the Catholics, we have the Protestant, we have the Anglican, we have the Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Egyptian Copts.
I hope you will forgive me for interrupting, and I hope the audience will forgive too, but we have less than 1 minute, Muhammad. I would like to end with a promise from you and me that in our next video, we will come back to this subject, because I think many people would like to learn from you, and maybe you can share some passages from the Kazantzakis book so that people can see how incredibly civilized a place Palestine has been. So let me thank you for our time together. I'm sorry to see that things are becoming dark there, but I know that you live very much on battery power. And is there anything you would like to say, just in a very quick close? I hope
no, nothing. Thank you for you and for the people who are watching us.
Thank you, Muhammad, and we will